This is a Dreamcast disc and is for use only on a Dreamcast unit. Playing this disc on a hi-fi or other audio equipment can cause serious damage to its speakers.
Dreamcast, up to 6 billion players.
Welcome back to the stage of history.
Why don't we play together?
Hey, it's time to make some crazy money. Are you ready? Here we go!
Please stop this disc now.
Hello and welcome to DreamPod episode 74. This is the Dreamcast Junkyard podcast, and we have with us a few guys today. We have the wonderful Tom. How are you doing, Tom?
Good afternoon. I'm doing well. How are you?
Very well, thank you. I'm
Excellent.
good. Very odd to be recording in the afternoon, but we all know why that is, I guess. I've also got with me Lewis. How are you doing?
I am doing very well. I have been vegging out with my fiance and playing Animal Crossing all day, and it's wonderful.
Amazing. Good game. Very good game.
It is.
And we also have a first-timer to the podcast. Not a first-timer to the Junkyard, though. He has been part of the Junkyard here and there since 2010, I believe, 2009, 2010, and that is Martin. How's it going, Martin?
Hello, yeah, I'm very well, thank you, and yeah, nice to be on the DreamPod. Listened since episode 0, so amazed and proud and pleased to be part of this. So, thank you guys.
Amazing. Just for listeners who maybe haven't been with us since as long as 2009. That seems like forever ago now. That's like 10, 11 years ago. My goodness. Can you give us a little bit of an origin story, I suppose, how you came how you came across the Dreamcast Junkyard and what you've been up to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I came across the Dreamcast Junkyard when I was doing something similar myself, not as good. Because it's long dead, I suppose you could say, which is the My Sega collection. It's the website's still up. You can Google it and find it if you like. But really, I was, just reporting on my Sega collection, and in my research online and everything, found that there were people doing a much nicer job of it. So there was the Dreamcast Junkyard and the Saturn Junkyard. And got in touch with Tom back in the day and wrote a couple of articles for the Dreamcast Junkyard. And that was all good fun. And then I moved to Japan. And when I was living there, time differences and just complete life difference really meant that I wasn't into the Dreamcast actively as much anymore. I no longer had a unit with me, so I wasn't playing and active. Did collect a few Sega things along the way, but I'll come to that in the future, I imagine. And then recently, now I'm back in Europe, found essentially my old box of Sega toys and bits and bobs. And got in touch with Tom because, I wanted to see how he was and if the Junkyard was still going. Of course it is, and is, busy than ever. And found that there was a podcast that I'd completely missed. So I listened, religiously from episode 0 all the way to the present day. So somehow I've got to tolerate hearing my own voice, but worry about that later.
Indeed. Well, that's brilliant. It's great that you're finally on one of the episodes after listening to every single one of them. All right, well, let's kind of move on to. I was going to say let's move on to what we're here for, but we always kind of start with a bit of an intro, and usually it's what have you been playing? But the last episode that I hosted, I did away with that. I'm going to do the same today, just because I like being a bit of an anarchist. So instead of what we've all been playing, I thought that we'd have a look and decide what was our best game of 2002 that came out in Europe, the last crop of games that were available for us to buy when the Dreamcast was still going. The list that I've got is Rez, Dragon Riders, Chronicles of Pern, Phantasy Star Online version 2, NBA 2K2, Conflict Zone, Evil Twin, Heavy Metal Geomatrix, Razor Freestyle Scooter, and Cannon Spike. Lewis, what was your favourite 2002 game?
I think I have to go with Rez because I feel that it's a game that is exactly what the Dreamcast is known for, those very unique, weird but wonderful games. And, it's stylish and overall just a great experience. And if you haven't played Rez, you need to play Rez. and play it in VR if you can too. So yeah, check it out. I think that it was a bit of a sad time for the Dreamcast because the PS2 had Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and we got Razor Freestyle Scooter. So just really explains everything.
Yeah, it was indeed a sad time. Next, Martin.
To be honest, it is also Rez. Comes from my gut feeling, and I can just comment on Rez is actually a very important game for me. I've followed it from Rez, but also I've got the kind of the demo vibes. So this is kind of the prototype Rez game. I've got that on Dreamcast when that was released on Assembler Games years ago. And I've followed Rez all the way through. So I have it on every single platform except for PSVR because I don't have the VR headset yet. I know Tom's got one, which I'm hoping he'll lend me one day. But I'm a big fan of Rez.
Tom, are you just? Is it going to be Rez across the board, or are you going to surprise us here?
Yeah, I'm afraid it's going to be Rez for me as well. I mean, this is an interesting list if you look at it. I mean, we've got games like Conflict Zone, which is actually one of the only real-time strategy games that was released on the Dreamcast, and to actually think about the fact that it was only released kind of in the final year of the Dreamcast is actually quite surprising. The other game on here that kind of piqued my interest when it came out was Evil Twin. Just because it was such a late kind of 3D platform release, and it's one of those games that really does kind of, I think it pushes the Dreamcast not because of how complex the game itself is, but because of how detailed the visuals are. There's a lot of, this is going to sound really stupid, but there's a lot of textures going on in that game. And when you're kind of jumping between the different platforms and whatnot, you can kind of see that the Dreamcast is maybe not because of the power of the console, but because of the way it's been programmed. It kind of chugs a bit, and I think it's because the game world is so detailed. So it's an interesting one. Horrendously bad cutscenes though, so but skip those if you get the chance. But I'm going to echo what Martin and Lewis have just said. I think Rez is my favourite. And on one final point, sorry. I know we're just talking about European releases, but if it was worldwide, I think my game from this period would be NHL 2K2, just because I love ice hockey and that's a fantastic game. Fair
enough. Yeah. I will say quickly, mine was probably Rez as well. But yeah, it was. I mean, just on its own, these list of games, these final games, even if you brought in some of the ones from other countries, would make for an interesting podcast just to look and see what the final crop of Dreamcast games was. But yeah, the kind of the point of looking at these is, these were the final games for the Dreamcast, the last ones that we ever were officially to see. But what if they weren't? What if the Dreamcast hadn't ended in 2002? What if Sega had gone down a different path and stayed in the hardware market? Well, you're in luck because that's exactly what we're here to talk about. Doing a little bit of a what if episode. So I guess the first question that I have, I'm going to talk to all of you, and we've got a few comments as well from Twitter that we'll kind of read out as we go. But the first question I think that's kind of a good one to start on is, could the Dreamcast have been a success? What would have had to happen for the Dreamcast to have been a success? What would have had to be different? If we're talking about what if the Dreamcast hadn't ended in 2002, how would it have been a success? What was the key to that, or what should have been the key to that?
I'll jump in first of all. I'd say, first of all, the PlayStation 2 not to have existed.
Right.
And for possibly for the Dreamcast to have had DVD functionality built in from the start. I know this is a really fanciful kind of topic that we could spend hours and hours talking about, but I think the demise of the Dreamcast is it's a series of unfortunate events that kind of set in motion. There wasn't one thing. Do you know what I mean? It was a cavalcade of different things that all came together, unfortunately, to spell the demise of it. And ultimately, there's the one thing that stops a system from being a success is whether it sells. And for it to sell, it needs to have something that the general public at large are going to go, wow, I need that in my life. And the one thing the Dreamcast didn't have, it had all the games, it had all the amazing peripherals, it had this bright, well, to us anyway, future when it first came out. What it didn't have was for the general consumer to say, I can play my DVDs on that. And I think for me, if it had had that, I know there's an interview, certainly there's one in your book, Andrew, nice little plug there, Dreamcast Year One, with Bernie Stolar, where he does actually say that, he was looking at getting the DVD functionality in there, but the bigger people said, no, we can't do it for the cost. But if it had DVD, I think we would have been talking about a different journey for the Dreamcast, personally.
Yeah. It's odd though, isn't it? Because no other console before the PS2 had that ability to play movies in that particular. You could play maybe a CD on the PS1. And listen to music. So it's odd that with the PS2 we saw that jump to it being a multimedia device, and it feels like the Dreamcast was kind of sat at that edge between pure game console and what game consoles were to become, which was the kind of all-in-one media device. Martin, what do you think? What needed to have changed? What needed to have been in place for the Dreamcast to have been a success?
Well, I think you've both raised fantastic points there. I would echo with what Tom has said about it being a multitude of events that led up to this. So for me, it really starts in the previous console generation, in the previous wars with the Saturn and the PlayStation. Mm. So the Saturn was brought to an end of early life, or an early end of life, if you like, for the system. And it was announced, we're stopping here and we're going to focus on the next thing. So there was almost a year with no games for the Saturn. I mean, releases came out, but it wasn't a full-on year. And that really puts doubt into a customer's mind. It's funny how it all works, but you really want to keep making, if you're manufacturing cars, you want your cars to be sold right up until the point you announce the new model. You don't want to stop and say, oh, we're going to build something new next year, because people look around and want to see progress. So I think that the seeds were sown with the Saturn, really. So that's the first comment. The second one is, in terms of media and everything, for me, I think it really needed to have the DVD player. I just think that was essential. So you're quite right in saying that games occupied a space where they were just games. So, you could play CDs and everything, but it wasn't like people were using them as CD players as much as the PlayStation 2 became the DVD player, because it was priced cheaper than many DVD players. And a whole family then could have a DVD player for your home theater, your home movies, and you could play all the games on it. So it's perfect. I think that the price could have been a bit higher as well. It came in at a very, very good price. I don't think the marketing was bad or poor, really. I just think that, as Tom said, there are a few issues, and I'm sure we'll get onto the games later and what would have happened otherwise. But I think in terms of starting off, everything was extremely positive, but people knew that, yes, there's the PlayStation 2 coming out. Sony have announced this great big multimedia company have announced that they will have a DVD player in there. I mean, Nintendo at present occupy an almost game-only sphere, right? With the Switch, there's no real multimedia on there, kind of a crippled Twitter interface and things like this, but they occupy that space very well. So Sega either had to pull all the stops out and really hammer down on Sony, which was at this point a real challenge, or really go off into their own direction, more a la Nintendo, which I think they kind of did, but we can talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. Lewis, I'll come to you next. What are your thoughts about what needed to happen for it to be a success in the first place?
Yeah, I want to echo what you all have said about it. The Dreamcast would have definitely had to have do the same things as its rivals or have similar things going on. Obviously, the DVD player is one of them. This isn't something that's like new to gaming. We see this all the time. We had the motion craze of the 7th generation. Everyone tried to do their own version of what the Wii was doing successfully. And so we've got the DVDs. It probably would have had to be playing those. And also one that we've not mentioned yet is actually dual analog sticks on the controller. I definitely think that would have been something that would have had to be introduced eventually, with more games being developed for that kind of control scheme. I mean, Sega did it before. So while the DVD player might have been a real hurdle, I think that the dual analog sticks would have been much easier. We had the 6-button controller with the Mega Drive. The Saturn did the 3D controller. PlayStation had brought out the dual analog stick controller for the PS1, despite there already being a controller without it. So it's not like a new controller being introduced would be hard. It's the DVDs, I think, that would have been the real hurdle for Sega.
Yeah. Absolutely. The thing is with all these things as well, it's not like they were pie in the sky either. These were things that Sega were actually actively thinking about at the time, and they just chose not to do them. from what we know, from what Bernie's told me as well, is that mostly just because of the cost of them. And so for me, it's almost like, you could say that the PS2 shouldn't have existed, or that that they should have put this and that in there. The big thing for it to have been a success is for Sega to have had more money. At the end of the day, if Sega if Sega wasn't on the verge of bankruptcy at the time, they could have added all these things in without having to worry so much about the cost of it. And I mean, I guess for them not to have been on the verge of bankruptcy, either Saturn had to have been a success, or they would have had to have some kind of massive investor in the company. And for me, we're talking very what if scenario here, but the whole point of it, when they started making the Dreamcast, their whole vibe about it was going into a very PC kind of space. They approached 3DFX, they approached Videologic, they approached Microsoft. So they're in a very PC centered area. And for me, it would have been, they needed to get Microsoft on board as more than just a provider of an operating system. They needed to get Microsoft on as a partner to provide the money that they required. I think if they'd have got Microsoft on board as much more than they were, I think then perhaps things might have been different, and they would have had the money to do what they needed to do to kind of be on level pegging with the PS2. I think that's what they needed to have done in my eyes anyway.
There's one thing I want to ask, and this is one I actually kind of want to throw out there, because you guys may have an answer for this, because it's one thing I'm wondering, is that basically I've heard all over the place, I've heard in groups on Facebook, I've heard from YouTube videos, people even have gone as far as to say that if the Dreamcast had reached its full potential, it would have been better looking, at least graphics wise, than the PS2. And I don't know how much nonsense that is. And I want to know if you guys would be able to answer that for me, because if the Dreamcast was to stay, it would have needed to be able to run a lot of the big seller games that would come out, games that were big hits on the PS2. Grand Theft Auto, for example.
I mean, I can't say from an actual technical perspective. I don't know, but from what I've heard, the difference in spec between them wasn't huge. The PS2 did some things better than the Dreamcast, and the Dreamcast did some things better than the PS2. So that they were different in that regard, but I think they were fairly comparable in terms of power. Tom, I don't know if you know any more than that.
I mean, I'm not an expert when it comes to this kind of thing, but what I will say is that when you do have some games which came out on both systems, the general consensus is that the PlayStation 2 versions do look slightly worse than the Dreamcast versions, and I can completely see that. I've seen that with my own eyes. The thing that people kind of forget, I think, is that the PlayStation 2 was in development for, while the Dreamcast was on shelves, the PS2 was still in development. There's a lot of graphical routines that the PlayStation 2 can do the Dreamcast can't do because they weren't implemented into the hardware. So I think, if the Dreamcast had continued as a competitor to the PS2, I think eventually we would have got to the point where if there were games on both systems, we'd have a situation sort of like we have now, where the ultimate version would have been on the PlayStation 2, and maybe a slightly downgraded version would have been on the Dreamcast, just because of, it. I know that's probably going to annoy a couple of people, but we have to look at it realistically. The PlayStation 2 I think it's a much more powerful piece of hardware than the Dreamcast actually is. So, I think we would have got to the point where, how you got games on the Switch, which they're the same games that are on the PS4 and on the Xbox One, but slightly less graphical fidelity. I think not so much with the graphics, but I think with the size of the games and that kind of thing, because you have to look at things like Half-Life. Fair enough, it wasn't a released game, but with the Dreamcast version, the game has to stop and load the game into the internal memory for it to continue to play. Whereas on the PlayStation 2, it doesn't do that. So it's things like that maybe that people like myself, who are not so technically minded, wouldn't initially see on the surface. But once the game's got bigger, there's those kind of limitations that you need to bring in. So the size of the discs, the GD-ROMs, I know we went back to the DVD situation here, but things like that, that we wouldn't necessarily think of straight away. We're thinking about graphics, but there's things underneath the hood that maybe aren't as clear-cut.
I think that the thing with the Switch is that people will buy the games because they're on the Switch and it has that benefit of the portability, whereas the Dreamcast is just another home console. So I don't know if people would have been more inclined to buy it on the Dreamcast because they love the Dreamcast, when if they had a PS2, it might look better or run better, so that's probably another thing to bear in mind as well.
the thing that you have to look at as well is when the PlayStation 2 came out, the Dreamcast was at like sort of year 2 of its life. So developers were just getting into the swing of getting games looking amazing on it. So look at things like Dead or Alive 2, and then look at the one on the PS2. The Dreamcast version looks better, but don't forget the PlayStation 2 had only just been really released. And when you get to the end of the PS2's lifespan, you've got games like God of War and Shadow of the Colossus, which personally I don't think would have been capable of being run on the Dreamcast, just because those games are actually pushing the PS2 to its absolute limit. They're doing things that they probably didn't think the PS2 could do, and I don't think the Dreamcast has the grunt to pull off games like Shadow of the Colossus, for example.
Yeah. I was just chipping in. I would say I agree with both the points there, that the Dreamcast lacks something compared to the PS2 in terms of absolute raw power, which is to be expected because in R&D terms, even 1 year is a huge amount of time. And at this time of computer processing, the difference that you can get within 2 years of, if you just think about the difference between the N64 and the Dreamcast, GoldenEye and games like this were released only just before the Dreamcast was putting out Crazy Taxi and Sonic Adventure and games that look this graphically clean. The Dreamcast can produce some very, very clean looking graphics and textures, especially through VGA and HDMI and things like this now. But what you can get out of the PlayStation in terms of textures and transparencies and things is just it's above that. So I think the Dreamcast struggles a little on the hardware graphics side, but I think it would have been fine. I think it would have been okay until you get a few years down the line when the PlayStation 2 is simply the obvious choice for everyone.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's like you say, it's not just the graphical power that they had either. It's as you said, Tom. It's the size of the discs that they have available to actually have the game on as well. And the fact that it's a gigabyte, just less than a gigabyte, I think it was. If discs never have exactly that amount on them. But what's a DVD? That's about 7 gigabytes.
Nearly 5.
Yeah.
4.7, it's 7 or 8 when it's dual layer or something, isn't it? So yeah, it's
at least 4 gigabytes. So let's say it's at least you've got at least 4 times the headroom, which is just, that's epic. So, yeah.
I mean, it sounds like we're dumping on the Dreamcast here. We're a Dreamcast podcast. We're obviously massive Dreamcast fans, and we're just trying to be realistic,
Yeah, exactly. We do. We're saying here we kind of almost want it to have done better. I mean, who doesn't want the Dreamcast to have done better? It would have been great. But it's kind of looking at why it didn't, and things like the graphical power and the fact that it had a small disc. It always struck me as odd that rather than go the DVD route, Sega went to Yamaha and got them to create a different disc. I'm guessing it was cheaper for them to do that, but why didn't they go with a format that already existed? It seems a bit strange. I
think that takes us down the route of the whole. Did piracy kill the Dreamcast? I mean, the whole GD-ROM and why not go with a format like CD-ROM, for example, or something like that is a whole different avenue. At this point, though, is it okay for me to just quickly talk a little bit about an article that I read in a magazine? We've discussed this prior to this podcast, but this is an article that was in Total Control magazine. Is that okay to talk about this now?
Go for it.
Yeah, cool. So we are talking about, could the Dreamcast have had upgrades and what are the technical limitations of the hardware? In the April 1999 edition. Let's create a new word, a new portmanteau. Issue of Total Control magazine, which was a short-lived UK magazine. There is actually quite an in-depth article about the future of the Dreamcast, because this is just on the cusp of the PS2 being released. And there's some interesting quotes that I pulled from the article. The first one is that Sega apparently is looking at the opportunity to upgrade the Dreamcast and make it a system that is infinitely expandable. So this is a quote from a Sega source in April 1999. The sky's the limit with the Dreamcast. We've created a box that is almost infinitely expandable. As new technologies come around, we'll be able to do anything we want to it. One of Sega's big pushes at the moment is the trend of the static box. There will no longer be a box coming out of Sega that we want to put on a shelf and forget about. The standard 1 box of 5 years model is gone. So they're saying basically that they want the Dreamcast to be something that people can maybe expand with, expansion cards and whatnot. And to a certain extent, we did get that with the broadband adapter and the karaoke unit, as useless as that is. But then the article goes on to say this. Sega plan to release a number of different versions of the Dreamcast. The machine now on sale in Japan and in September in Europe and US is version 1.1. Version 1.2 will be significantly different, and if we ever get as far as version 4.1, it is likely to be a vastly superior machine. So, you don't know how much of that is just, conjecture on the part of the author, but it does raise interesting questions as to how far Sega had a plan and how they were going to kind of change the internals of the system, maybe add more memory, newer, smaller, more economically efficient chipsets, that kind of thing. Even, as we're talking about it, the fabled DVD drive upgrade. So, yeah.
I just wonder how much consumers would think about buying a separate add-on when the PS2 is an all-in-one system, or would they feel good about having a Dreamcast and then they say, well, here's the new version. I felt a little bit like that with the new Nintendo 3DS. I was like, well, are they just going to have another version after that? Like, there's kind of that. It makes you doubt things. It's the same with the Switch. I was doubtful about getting a Switch recently because they've already upgraded it to have a better battery. So you kind of feel like you don't want to go ahead and get the current one because it may, they may turn around and be like, well, here's the new version. So while that's a really awesome idea that there could have been more versions and better versions of the Dreamcast, I do wonder how much consumers would have gravitated to that idea.
I suppose we did, in a way, get upgraded versions of the Dreamcast because they revised the cooling systems, the fans that were in the different revisions of the console, even down to the GD-ROM drives themselves, because obviously some of them will read copies disc, some won't. Interesting point as well you mentioned there, Lewis, with the DVD add-on. I know that in the UK that some stores were selling, or there was a bundle with a Dreamcast console and a DVD player that you could get as one package. And obviously that didn't really change the fortunes of the system. So,
no.
But with the, I don't think the DVD player made was a make or break move for Sega. But I do think it was key. But the problem is that in the model with any kind of product, when you say we're going to expand it, improve it, and things like this, you always have to maintain backwards compatibility, and you need people 5 years down the line when they buy God of War on the Dreamcast on a DVD that now plays in a new Dreamcast. How it doesn't play on the old one is consumers hate this, so it's consumer suicide to do something like that. So then you're always held back by what you originally put out there. Unless you have add-ons like the 32X, and we all know how well that kind of stuff goes.
Yeah. But we see that all the time nowadays. I mean, you mentioned, Lewis, the new 3DS. That's one of the times where they actually, it was backwards compatible with everything prior to that. But the problem was that it then had exclusive games that would not play on previous versions. So the whole new 3DS, like they had Xenoblade Chronicles 3D, that would not play on any other console apart from the new Nintendo 3DS. And that's an issue. But then we also have things like the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 4 Pro, the Xbox One and the Xbox One X. They significantly upgrade the specs of the console. But games will play on either version. And not just that, you look at the Xbox One X, that has a 4K Blu-ray player in. The original Xbox One did not have that. So, it even upgraded the drive to a completely new format, very similar, albeit very similar. It's a different format. So it's not like we don't see that today, but I think a good question is, would consumers have sprung for that back then in the late 90s, early 2000s? Is that something that consumers would have gone for? Because it was a very different time, I suppose.
The things so you've kind of touched on this before in an earlier DreamPod, with the way modern consoles are now has never been more like a PC. And I don't mean that in a bad way necessarily. I mean, I can go off on that tangent, but I'm not going to. What I'm going to say instead is that back in the day, 2000 or so, I remember our home computer with Windows 98 being an absolute just beast in physical size of a computer, and it struggled to run incoming. But it could run it. But the amount of graphical changes you need to do and upgrading parts, and how every game is different then. On your friend's PC, he had a much better PC than our family did. Not that I've got a chip on my shoulder, but the point is that the games are always very different, whereas this is part of the beauty of a console, is that you can release the game, and there you are. Everyone gets the same experience. It's much easier to go forwards, whereas consoles are less like that today. But that's a bit more of a tangent.
Yeah, it's a different world now for sure. And yeah, I think that was my question. I guess is, would we have accepted a different version of the Dreamcast? You know, if we'd have bought the original on launch day. You know, if in 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line, Sega had said, okay, here you go, here's a version of the Dreamcast. You can play all the old games on it, but now has DVD drive built in. It's got a slightly better, CPU. It can run games a bit faster. Would people have bought into that? Would they have bought into an upgrade down the line, do you think, at that point?
I think it would have had to have some pretty stellar games that would warrant the purchase, I think. I don't think if they were to say, yeah, you can play Sonic Adventure and it runs better or something, you know, it'd have to have new games to sort of coax people into getting the new version.
I was always one of them people back in that period who had one console, and it was always a bit of a chore to try and get rid of the previous consoles to have enough money to buy the next one. So I think that if Sega had, you know, come out and said, oh, here's another thing that's, you know, a bit more powerful and can play these games, I would have been thinking, I've already got my Dreamcast. There's already PS2 out. Do I need this as well? Do I need to? Is this what I really need? It would have been, to be honest, it probably would have been a no from me at that point. But then, you know, we did actually get that in the end with the Xbox. Yeah, didn't we?
Yeah. True, that's true.
They could have run a kind of, you know, how Apple do the and other phone manufacturers are available, do a kind of exchange program where you take in your current black mirror and you get another one back. You could do that with your Dreamcast or something. That would be the only way to get me, because I'd already Mega Drive, superb. Sega Saturn, I was a massive fan of, still am, but that didn't win. And the Dreamcast, so they would have really needed to have said, okay, we've got a new Dreamcast, and if you've already got the old one, we will do an exchange program or something like that. That would have been better, because otherwise you get beyond buyer's remorse.
Yeah. Although, remember that Sega are guilty of saying, you've got this, now here's the other thing, and it sticks onto the side, so... They'd kind of used up their 9 lives at this point, I think. So it'd be pushing it to do this, as good as it sounds.
I completely agree, but the best thing in my mind about the 32X and the Mega CD adding on to the Mega Drive is in Sega Gaga at the end of the game, when you have the shoot 'em up at the end of the game, and you get to see all of the consoles connect together. There is nothing more satisfying than clicking everything together like that. But in terms of product, it's not great.
Have you seen that viral video of the guy with 12 32Xs all plugged in top of each other, and it still plays Sonic and Knuckles or something? And it's just like that. Wow. That is brilliant.
So good.
So I guess what we're saying here then is that it would have had to have been right from the start for it to have been a success. It would have had to have those things. You'd had to have the DVD drive, from the get-go. But we're saying it probably wouldn't have mattered so much that it wasn't quite as powerful as the PS2, I guess, so long as it was equivalent in terms of the media that it could play, I suppose. Are we saying that the DVD player was the biggest thing then, do you think?
I think it's definitely one of the biggest things. What you have to take into consideration here is that I think the Dreamcast and the PS2 are aimed at completely different sort of segments of the market. Dreamcast was kind of, Sega, they're known for their arcade games. They did them impeccably. All of the arcade ports on the Dreamcast are pretty much, arcade perfect. The PlayStation 2 had a slightly different tangent. It was like longer form single player games, for the most part. So I think if the Dreamcast had come out and it was, it did have things like the DVD drive, just to sway those people who may be on the fence, then obviously it would have stuck around for a bit longer.
Do you know what else? It pains me to say it, but EA Sports.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I was going to say this as well.
So I do think I completely agree with everything you've just said, Tom. The DVD player, I think, there's no point in ordering them, perhaps, but let's put it at number one. It needed to have, because it gives you that extra space ahead, in terms of capacity, if nothing else, even for not playing DVDs at home, which was a winner. It just gives you the extra space for the game data. But EA Sports, if you had FIFA, NHL, Madden, or all like basketball games and all this kind of stuff, even though the 2K games were absolutely superb, and I kind of missed that era of being able to have 3 or 4 different ice hockey games to choose from, and not the same rehash that EA do with updates, and it's basically a game of menus that you're going through. It's critical to get the kind of the mass public involved at that time in gaming. I remember it was around the time when I went to uni, everyone playing ISS Pro, and I think that's what it's called. That's the space station, but it was the whatever the football game was on the PlayStation. Everyone was playing this on the PS2. People who weren't really gamers, you would say, and I was definitely in the nerdy gamer camp. The football games were what won so many people over. So yeah, EA Sports is another one for me.
Yeah. Very true.
It's interesting on the topic of EA. Andrew. There is actually now an official released EA game on the Dreamcast, and that is Fade to Black, which was released recently by Josh Prod, sort of as an aftermarket. But it is actually credited as being an official release of Fade to Black because the developers gave their official blessing to it. But that game was actually originally put out by Electronic Arts, so we do now have an EA game on the Dreamcast. Kinda.
All these years later. That's amazing.
Just in time.
But it is really interesting that whole thing about EA not putting their games on the system. I mean, you mentioned the book earlier, Tom, the Dreamcast Year One, but the whole
what's it called again?
section,
Sorry, I didn't
it's
catch
called
that.
Dreamcast Year One.
Okay.
I'm hawking it wherever I can, Tom.
Available at all good online bookstores because there are no more physical ones, but that's a separate topic.
Yeah. But yeah, the interview with Bernie that I had was really telling because he mentioned in the interview, I don't think I included it in his interview, but it's something I included in the story section for sure, is that, he had conversations with the big, the head honcho of EA, because I think they were friends, and they were like, oh yeah, we would totally want EA games. That'd be great. But the problem was that EA wanted exclusivity in sports games, which, and also, wanted a lot of money for it. And it's just not something that at the time Sega could afford or was interested in, I suppose. But I suppose the point I want to make is that a lot of these changes that we've mentioned are things that I know for a fact Bernie pushed for in the console, and he left shortly before the console launched in America. Obviously, it'd been out for a whole year in Japan before this, but all of these things are things from what I gather from one side of the conversation. Sure, it's from Bernie's side that he pushed for in the Dreamcast. So the having a DVD drive, having a dual analog controller, having internal storage even, and having EA games. These are things that he wanted, but either Sega didn't want them or couldn't afford them. Perhaps if Bernie had stayed on and hadn't left when he had, perhaps things would have looked a bit different as well.
So what you're saying is it's his fault? No, I'm joking.
Well, no, these are things that he wanted, and he absolutely wouldn't have wanted to put in it. It's Sega of Japan, if anybody, who kind of put the stops on all of this, and for good reason. They were practically broke, but it was. If he'd have stayed on, perhaps he could have pushed further, and perhaps he could have cultivated these relationships that they needed with other people. My kind of pie in the sky idea that Microsoft could have come on board as a bit more than just a supplier of an OS. Stuff like that could have potentially turned the system around. Perhaps, I don't know.
Oh yeah,
I'm not
totally.
sure.
If the story of EA saying that they wanted to have exclusivity to all the sports games was the actual reason for them not getting involved, how selfish is that? So you're trying to tell me that every other developer who maybe had a sports idea or a game that was in development for the Dreamcast were then to just say, oh, sorry, we can't make a football game or an ice hockey game or whatever else. That just, it smacks of like a petulant child saying, I want my own way, or I'm going to take my toys home. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't sit right with me.
It just sums EA up, really, doesn't
it?
Well,
to be fair, yeah.
It's not the most unbelievable story I've ever heard.
No.
With regards to EA, just to kind of final knife in EA's back.
Yes.
They were really becoming popular at this point. This is when, or at least they were getting big market share. They really were pushing FIFA. I remember FIFA 97 and 98. It was really becoming, a big steamroller of releases that they were going for, this whole yearly sports thing. And I can believe that they did want exclusivity, and we're doing this, and that's it. If you want us on, because they had the upper hand at this point, is what I'm trying to say. Whereas Sega, on the other hand, in Japan, would have been like, well, yes, we're not interested. We've got lots of people who can make other games, and it's not that important to us. Because in Japan, sports games were never, they were never the big sellers, and it's this whole sports sim thing is a Western kind of phenomenon, really. But,
true, very true. But I mean, talking of games in general, though, I mean, I keep mentioning Bernie. He's my source. He's my font of information. I know he's not the be all and end all, but he's my font of information at the moment. He's very adamant that they were in talks for things like Grand Theft Auto 3, World of Warcraft, all of those kind of games, and these are potentially things that could have seen the light of day had Dreamcast gone longer. If the DVD drive had been there, if they'd had more money behind them, if it had gone on longer than 2002, what do you think those years would have looked like gaming wise? What would we have started to see coming from Sega, but also third parties? What could have been in terms of gaming, do you think?
I think a massive uptick in actual PC ports would have started to come through, because that was one of the main things that really kind of piqued my interest when I first heard about the Dreamcast and how close the architecture was to PC technology of the time. I don't want to sort of blow my own trumpet, but I did write an article about this quite a while back called 10 PC games that could have been on or should have been on the Dreamcast or something like that. And it was basically games that were hinted at that were going to be coming to the Dreamcast but never were. So we had things like Alien vs Predator, the PC version, Jeff Cramman's Formula One, Max Payne, obviously that was one that was in development before it was cancelled, Kingpin, stuff like that. So I think we would have actually saw those games come to fruition, and it would have been nice to have had the option to just test out and play some of those games that were the sole preserve of the PC back in those sort of late 90s days.
Obviously, Shenmue, after Shenmue 2, there was going to be, I think Yu Suzuki had ideas for like 6, 7, 8 games in this series. And obviously the more you'd go through them, things that you'd done in the past would have more of an effect in the future. Like, just little things like when you take the photograph of Nozomi at the end of 1 and which photograph you pick, just things like that would have an impact on your relationship later on with her. So that idea is absolutely fascinating, that there was going to be even more in the future for Shenmue, but unfortunately we never got those, and instead got Shenmue 3
Carry on. You're digging a hole here. I'm waiting.
I like it, but we'll talk about that another time, maybe.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, we had a question about it on Twitter, didn't we? And from somebody, and we answered it. And yeah, you're probably right, Lucy. It's a very different game than what we would have got if they'd have continued at the time. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad game. Sorry, Martin, are you going to say something there?
So I would completely agree. Again, with those points, I would also add that for me, what would have changed completely is online gaming. So I think when the Dreamcast started, let's say in '98, all of the games that I was mostly playing then were Crazy Taxi, Sonic Adventure, loads of single player, loads of arcade games. It was one of the best systems to have your friends around and play with 4-player games. I was playing so many games with my brother. We just name a game and have these brilliant memories of playing together. But there was that modem built in. And I think that, the first online game that I ever played on a console was Choo Choo Rocket. And that is an extremely simple puzzle game, if you like. I mean, I'm not decrying it. It's absolutely amazing and incredibly complicated, but it's simple in its nature and how you play it. But I could see it getting extremely complicated with what games we could have had. For example, like if there was a Headhunter 2, and how much more, if we'd have started to explore open world gaming with the Dreamcast, how that could have gone. Because yeah, GTA, again, that's in my list of games that would have been needed to have really been, because now a Grand Theft Auto game is just, if one of those was exclusive for a system, you can forget making another system now. It's that important. Yeah. So the GTA 2 that we got, which I actually really enjoy, is such a different game to the GTA 3 and what we have now in terms of Grand Theft Auto. So online gaming and open world games, this kind of expands into that territory. I think we would have seen more of online racing, Project Gotham, etc., etc.
Online gaming could have actually been one of the things that Sega could have ran with and championed even more, because let's face it, the PS2 had a lot going for it in comparison, but online gaming was one of the sort of more trickier, badly executed things on it. Didn't you have to install, add something to the back of the PS2? And no one I knew played online on PS2, but I know lots of people who played Dreamcast back in the day online because it was so much easier to actually set up. The same goes for the GameCube. That was another weird system for that. I think obviously the original Xbox was great as well for online, but maybe if that partnership with Microsoft had happened, that maybe would have never existed. So
it's true.
That's true. But with the having the online there, for me, that it really could have been the saving grace. I think it was just a year too early, perhaps, even. If the broadband adapter would have been there in 99 or as default on release again, and we didn't have broadband at home, so I don't know how I'm kidding, but when I went to university, everywhere, you had Ethernet connections and things. Online gaming then, it would have changed everything, because you've got this fantastic controller that has expansion ports built into the controller. So you've got your microphone, you could have touched the headset and start calling people rude names and swearing at their mothers and things like this. We could have done all that on a Dreamcast instead of on an Xbox.
It would have been so glorious to shout swears into that little weird microphone on the controller. It's interesting about the broadband adapter you mentioned there, Martin. I don't know if you guys listen to other game podcasts. I listen to a podcast called the Giant Bombcast. And there's a guy on there called Jeff Gerstmann who always talks about the days of Dreamcast online multiplayer. And he says that one of his anecdotes is about having a broadband adapter when he was playing Quake 3 Arena with other people online who were still using dial-up. And it said it was so disjointed that you kind of had this weird, dual people having different experiences. So him with his broadband, it was so smooth, and people with the dial-up were just kind of jumping around on the screen, that kind of thing. So I think you would have had a fractured... if it had come out with the broadband adapter, then obviously it would have been better, but less people would have been able to play it because less people had broadband. I don't know what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it would have split the market up.
That's what I was trying to say. Thank you.
Yeah, you get people who'd buy the broadband adapter, but it would be few and far between at that particular time. I think what you were saying, Martin, about it being a bit too early, perhaps is right. Yeah. Because it was on the cusp of broadband becoming the big thing, and if they'd have waited an extra year,
we had to. Well, I say we had to. My dad had to install a second phone line in the house because he was sick of picking up the phone and hearing a modem when he needed to make a call. So he actually got a second line, quite a good price from BT, actually, which was amazing considering their prices these days. But that's a separate comment. But yes, I think that it was too early. This kind of folds in. Part of the problem was they killed the Saturn. So if they're Sega and they're a company and they say in 97, that's it now, we're not doing Saturn, you'll have to wait for our next thing. That next thing has to come soon because everyone needs paying. The company needs to keep going. You can't wait until the end of 99 and release something like, here's our new thing for the millennium, because no one will be working in the company. It's extremely difficult to do things like that. So it does, part of it's on the Saturn and part of it's on this DVD, broadband, online gaming. And
absolutely. I think the online gaming was absolutely something that would have been a bigger thing. I mean, mentioning World of Warcraft there, can you imagine? That's the preserve of the PC gamer. But if you had something like World of Warcraft on the Dreamcast, you've got the keyboard and mouse, you've got the microphone, as you say. If people had been able to play that on their Dreamcast, that opens up that style of game much earlier to a lot more people, because it wasn't until Final Fantasy XI, I think, came out on the PS2 that you really saw a massively multiplayer online RPG on a console. And as we said, you had to buy a separate peripheral in order to connect it. It was much later on, I think, in the PS2's life that came to be in the first place. So, the Dreamcast already have that stuff built in, having that kind of game available, that could have catapulted it, absolutely, because not everybody can afford. I mean, as we said near the beginning of the podcast, not everybody can afford a super great PC. That they're expensive at the best of times, and then having to upgrade them constantly. If you have this one device that's able to play games like, World of Warcraft, or these FPS games that you can play online with people, I think that would have been.
I'm wondering if Sega kind of realised they'd cocked up with the modem that was packaged in each region sooner than we think, because a lot of the games that were shipped with online functionality in the US, when they came out in PAL territories, had all of that stuff stripped out. So things like Outrigger, Daytona USA, even things like Unreal Tournament, which was an online shooter, was offline only in PAL. It's like, what? So, maybe they knew that they kind of, I think we cocked up here, lads. Do you know what I mean? So
yeah.
Even the Saturn had online games in Japan. So it's each region. I think you're right, Tom. Each region had a vastly different kind of ability to take online. What I was going to say, coming back to so I think World of Warcraft and these kind of MMOs and things like this, that comes back to, for me, Phantasy Star Online, as you asked right at the beginning, favourite games from that era. For me, it is Rez, but Phantasy Star Online gets the kind of honourable mention because I played that years later when I had the broadband adapter, and the chaps at DC Talk .net, I believe, were having these games these online games of Phantasy Star Online that I'd never played before. I'd never played this game. Got myself a copy and absolutely loved it. And this was years down the line. And it was almost as if the Dreamcast was still going because I was playing online with people and everything was current. It was fine. But in games like MSR and stuff like this, if you could have just downloaded a ghost lap of someone, that would have been really, if all these kudos points and everything, and you see the leaderboards, online leaderboards for games and things like this, where the dial-up modem could have just been on for a few minutes and you get all of the leaderboards, you could download some ghosts, things like this. That would have given you more interaction. That would have made the games feel bigger than they are, perhaps. I think a lot more of that would have come in.
We saw some of that with the DLC for games like Sonic Adventure, where you could download themes for the levels and stuff. So yeah, if they could have really, brought DLC into this plan as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was at the time when DLC wasn't really a thing. It was quite a novelty, wasn't it? And unlike today, where it's a kind of a dime a dozen. In order to play the game, you must have DLC. But yeah, I think definitely things like being able to download extra bits for games or ghosts, or that would have been great. But yeah, it just didn't happen. And like you said, Tom, it was a time where the different regions had completely different dial-up modems in them as well. Like Japan and America had the 56K one, and we had the 33. So it was different speeds. But not only that, America especially had an actual service that people would subscribe to. And I think that one of the reasons that games lasted longer online over there is because they had that paid for service, whereas here we got it for free. Essentially, we had free gaming. We weren't paying Sega for it. No. So they perhaps missed a trick, and it's something that is standardized now anyway, isn't it? You pay Sony or Microsoft for a pass to play online. And we didn't do that here. It was free. In America, they had SegaNet.
The other what if, just to there's something else that I'd be interested in hearing your guys' thoughts on this. It's something that I thought about back in kind of the mid 2000s, so around 2005, when I got my I think second iPod. Was I always wanted the VMU to have a headphone jack to be able to download MP3s directly onto the unit and just walk around with that as my music source. That would have been, to me, if you, of course, do something about the battery technology, separate point. But let's really go what if here. I think it would have been a real game changer to have, I don't know, half a gigabyte. That was probably quite a lot back then, but just enough space on a VMU and save MP3s directly there with an online store. Of course, you've got copyright and blah, blah, region protection and everything. But I just think that would have been a nice little accessory that was already built in, if you like, to the Dreamcast. Everyone could have done this.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are prototype versions of that exact device. You can find images online. So that was something that Sega was looking at doing. But yeah, if that had come out, then that again could have been another game changer. The thing with the Dreamcast is that obviously over here in Europe or in the States, we kind of see the Dreamcast primarily as a gaming system with online functionality. In Japan, it was actually being marketed as a complete lifestyle accessory. So it was for video conferencing, it was for checking your stocks and shares, it was for doing your shopping. There's so much stuff that exists only in Japan that we never got over here or in the United States. And I think that there are some things which would have been universal. And I think the VMU MP3 player device, that would have been something that could have been another killer app.
Mm. Absolutely, it would have been. I mean, yeah, it was right on the verge of things like the iPod, like you say, like 2004, 2005 is when we saw the iPods, and if you had something like that played MP3s before those came out, that would have been fantastic. I mean, that you had the iPod Shuffle, which didn't have that much memory on it at all. I think you could load maybe 100 songs onto it, if that. And if the VMU was capable of even half of that, years beforehand, you'd have had. Something.
Can you imagine? Can you imagine trying to dial up to Napster on your Dreamcast? So
geez,
to get
the
latest,
so great.
The latest Hearsay song.
No, not so great. Yeah, I mean, there probably are some issues with that. To be fair, with the infrastructure that we had.
I noticed you didn't say anything about Hearsay though.
What's it? What? I won't hear anything bad said about Hearsay. What's wrong with Hearsay? But yes, no. I mean, technology-wise, there's so much that could have been done, and it was just all down to money, wasn't it? At the end of the day, if they'd have had the money up front, all these things could have been done previously. It almost seems to me that, like you said, Martin, it's to do with the Saturn at the end of the day because of how they handled the Saturn.
Blame the Saturn, I say.
Yeah, I mean,
blame the Saturn.
But it was. I mean, with the Saturn, they either had to stick with their guns and go, okay, sod it, we've got a 2D console. Yeah, okay, PlayStation is 3D. Let's just make the best of it. Because actually, it was a damn good 2D console, and it sold particularly, okay in Japan. But the fact that they kind of went and tampered with it later and went, okay, let's just add this extra video processor and kind of bodge it so it can play 3D games, but it's extremely difficult to develop for. That kind of. They just made a really bad decision, I guess, really.
What I'm hearing here again is let's blame Bernie.
Yeah. Bernie wasn't around for the Saturn, Tom.
I know, but he killed it, didn't he? He was like, right, that's it.
Sorry, Bernie, if you're listening. Not blaming you for it all. But yeah, so I guess the next thing to talk about then is there were a lot of Sega games that came out after the Dreamcast finished. And we got, so one of the tweets I mentioned earlier, we got some tweets in, some replies to a tweet that we put out. One of them is from, and I don't know if I should just kind of spell this out, CABBAC, which is at official CABBAC. He kind of actually had a tweet back in January that he forwarded on. And this was basically just a list of all of the games that came out on other consoles later, mostly for the Xbox, I think. I'm just going to run down them because I think it's an interesting list. And, these are games that Sega produced, Sega published, and then came to the Xbox. And these are Gun Valkyrie, Headhunter Redemption, Panzer Dragoon Auto, Toe Jam and Earl 3, Shinobi, Nightshade, Crazy Taxi 3, House of the Dead 3, Super Monkey Ball 1 and 2, those were GameCube, I think, Sonic Heroes, Otogi 1 and 2, Virtua Fighter 4, Sega GT 2002, Outrun 2, he's missed off there, Jet Set Radio Future.
I was going to say.
Yeah. There's a lot there that came out on other consoles. I think that was like 2003, 2004. And these are all games that we would have likely seen on the Dreamcast had it continued. Do you think games like this would have sold the console to more people? Are they games that would have got more people to buy a Dreamcast if the Dreamcast had been still going at that point?
I don't think so. I think it's more of the same in a lot of these sense. This stuff. It's interesting though that a lot of these games do have beta versions for the Dreamcast. So Toe Jam and Earl does. Which is playable. I know Gun Valkyrie does as well, although that one hasn't been leaked. It was just began development online. On the Dreamcast. But yeah, I think for the most part, a lot of them are very much Sega kind of pick up and play in the same vein as a lot of the stuff that was on the Dreamcast. So I don't know. The jury's out, really. I mean, how well did they sell on the Xbox? Do we have general sales figures? I know most of them are quite well regarded, but whether or not they sold a lot, I don't know.
I don't think they sold a huge amount, to be perfectly honest.
It's like things like Jet Set Radio, innit? It's like everyone. It's like you mentioned Jet Set Radio on Twitter now, and everyone goes mental. But at the end of the day, the game just didn't sell that well. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of it's almost like it's like retroactive or retrospective kind of hype, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I saw something a while back, and I can't put my finger on the actual source right now, but it was something to do with sales figures of Dreamcast games, and some of them sold so ridiculously poorly. It's not even worth. It's things like MSR, some of the most popular games, sold like 10,000 copies or something. It's like, what?
Really?
That low? And it's like,
that's mad.
Yeah, it's mad, isn't it?
That's crazy.
Yeah. So
I do also wonder if games like on this list, for example, we've got Sonic Heroes. I think that was one of those games where it was popular probably because it wasn't just on a Sega console. Like everyone I knew had it. You know, I knew a guy with a GameCube who had it, a guy with a PS2 who had it. You know, opening up those IPs actually, I think, helped these games a lot. And I think we look at the list, and it's an absolutely fantastic list that's been compiled here. But the reason why this list is so cool is because those games are great, but like Tom said, they're more great as games, not necessarily ones that would have been a big success for Sega if they were just confined to the Dreamcast.
I think things like Jet Set Radio Future and Sega GT, they were quite sort of popular because they were pack-in games for the original Xbox. Yeah. So I think that's why more people are kind of familiar with those franchises now. Sorry, Martin.
It's fine. With the so exactly as Lewis was saying, when you've got the issue of having games on a platform that already exists, then people buy for that platform. But I remember being gutted when the Dreamcast was cancelled, and a load of my friends were thrilled because Sega had just announced they're going into the software business on multiple platforms. So they said, "Oh yeah, that game that we played around yours now, we can, the sequel's coming out on my system." And I'm like, "Oh great, good for you." So it's a very interesting situation. I mean, as many of you probably did, I also ended up getting an Xbox. Because it really does feel in many ways, not from the hardware, physical appearance. I mean, it's a very kind of Americanized console. But in terms of the games and just the feel of the overall interaction, it did feel very Dreamcast-y. And as Tom was saying, games that actually literally came with the system were Sega games. So it almost felt like the Dreamcast 2 in that sense. Yeah.
In a lot of ways, like the online, but even the controller. I mean, not the size of the controller, but the fact that it had ports for a memory card in the controller itself.
The first controller was like that Mad Catz bad boy, wasn't it? It was this kind of dinner plate.
The Duke.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hasn't Seamus Blackley, the guy who designed the Xbox controller, he has actually come out and said on Twitter that he was vastly influenced by the Dreamcast controller. So there's a lot of it's all entangled. It's all intertwined,
Yeah.
Does he have massive hands?
Couldn't say.
Tom's not seen them. So yeah, I mean that kind of brings on nicely because a lot of people do say that the Xbox and to an extent as well the Xbox 360 feel like the natural progression from the Dreamcast for a lot of people. And just as you said, Martin, what would have happened though if we'd have seen the Dreamcast do well? Would we have seen Microsoft come into the market in the way they did, do you think? Or do you think Microsoft would have sat back because Sega almost gave them almost like a gap, I suppose. There was a gap that could be filled by them leaving. Do you think that Microsoft would have come into the market? And if they did, do you think they would have done as well if the Dreamcast had still been going?
That is a good question. On one hand, I really think that Microsoft ultimately is a software company, basically like how Steve Jobs said, Apple is a software company. They just happen to make the hardware because no one else can make it as good as they need it to be. So for me, it's a really interesting question. If Sega was still around, would Microsoft have said, look, we want some of this gaming space? Maybe they could have provided the whole online platform and called it the Xbox Online, and maybe who knows? We could have seen cross-platforming gaming from the early doors if say Sony then licensed this as well. That's one thought I've often wondered about. I think it wouldn't have been a hardware race for Microsoft. It would have been almost strange to have entered, because who's going to build a console right now? I mean, for example, when we've got these players playing currently, you're not going to come into this market until someone leaves. So yeah, exactly as you said, it was a perfect opportunity for Microsoft to say, okay, we'll do the hardware ourselves. There's
an interesting sort of tidbit as well to note at this point, is that Sega were actually trying to get Microsoft to allow the Xbox to be Dreamcast compatible, so you could put Dreamcast games into it. And for whatever reason, that never came off. But it's also interesting to note as well that just before the Dreamcast kind of finally disappeared under the waves, as it were, there was this thing called the Pace box, which Sega were kind of promoting as this download-only TV box that you could download games onto that, you know, had Dreamcast hardware inside it. So maybe we could have seen a kind of hybrid system that was a set-top box and a games machine. So you know, the
Divers Dreamcast.
Yeah, you know. So
I wonder about the Xbox, because I feel that the Xbox, for this is, I mean, it's probably down to a number of reasons, and one of them may be because they were able to replace Sega, and probably if Sega was still there, they would have gone against the idea of actually joining the race. But I remember the Xbox being this thing that came in with a lot of things that were lacking from other consoles. The graphics and all these were what everyone was going on about, and I think that it kind of reminds me of the way the Xbox One X appeared in a way down the line, is that it kind of came out to say, look, we look better than all that, like we're the big boy console. You know, I think that's one of its major selling points. Obviously, Halo was like the big game that looked incredible on that console. So, I mean, probably, I think the fact that Sega left was a big factor. But I don't know. I wonder if they could have held their own, you know, if they'd have just come in with Sega still existing. I mean, Microsoft were trusted at this point. It's not like they had any bad rep like Sega did. So maybe people would have gravitated to them.
Possibly. I mean, it kind of leads us on nicely as well to kind of my final question before we maybe look at some of the Twitter stuff. But the kind of the final question I had was, what would have been next for Sega if Dreamcast had a normal lifespan, if it had gone on to like 2004, 2005 perhaps? What would have happened next? Would we have seen a Dreamcast 2? Would they have gone in a different direction entirely? What do we think?
Oh, well, it's hard to say, because that would have to mean that the Dreamcast would have been a success, which would have been only their second console to have been an actual success, because before that, the only one that was really successful was the Mega Drive, the standalone Mega Drive, not the Mega CD and all that crap. The Saturn was a bit of a failure. So maybe we could have seen a Dreamcast 2, just because we had revisions of the Mega Drive. We didn't have any revisions of the other stuff that kind of failed. Well, we did with the Mega CD, but I won't go into that. I think it's pretty. Yeah, it's a weird question to actually think about. If as you say, the Dreamcast had continued to 2005 or something around that era, then maybe we would have. Yeah, well, we would have seen another console, because they wouldn't have gone bankrupt or, you know, lost so much money, and the industry would have continued to have been lucrative. I think it's weird though when you think about it. Like you've got console manufacturers like Nintendo who have hit system after hit system, and because they sell so many and have so much money, they can take a knock like they did with the Wii U, but then just bounce back with something like the Switch, which is amazing. So if it hadn't been for the successive failures of the Mega Drive add-ons, then the Saturn, and then the Dreamcast, it was just one punch too many. Yeah. If it had been successful and been the other way around, I think we would still see Sega as a hardware manufacturer today, personally. So
I think that one of the things I want to mention here, and I do apologise if all of us have been slightly negative this episode, instead of thinking of all these wonderful, like you say, Andrew, pie in the sky ideas of this wonderful future for Sega and the Dreamcast. Sega, you know, we see it as this incredible company who brought us all these unique games on this dying system, and they were, you know, they're so incredible and revered. But if they were to continue being hardware manufacturers, they probably may not have been as unique as they were for the Dreamcast. They had to bring out games to get us to buy the console, and it resulted in all these ridiculous, strange ideas that mud thrown at the wall, and see if it would stick. Basically,
that's a good point. It's a very good point. That, to be honest,
if they were doing well, do you think we might have just ended up with Dreamcast 2, best console for Call of Duty?
Yeah. No, good point.
Yeah, that's I echo your sentiment completely there. That the Dreamcast 2 would not have had an improved VMU. I don't think there'd be VMU. I think it would be, possibly wireless controller. At this point, dual analog sticks. It would be much more, you could say, almost generic and more widely accepting, and have all of these. Yeah, you'd have the EA games, the Call of Duty, the kind of grey first-person shooters, and all of the yearly sports games. You wouldn't have Crazy Taxi. Or a game like Crazy Taxi that's been invented, because at some point someone sat down and said, I'm going to make a game that is a taxi, arcade game. And that happened. And to do that takes a very kind of unique approach, not how do we make another, which war do we pick to put our simulation in? It's, yeah.
The important thing as well is that arcades would have eventually were going to die as well. So we would have probably seen a lot of, bloody hell, I'm really negative now, aren't I? We would have seen less.
God, Lewis. God.
We would have seen less of these amazing arcade ports as well from these great Sega games, which is a lot of what the Dreamcast is known for.
I think the Dreamcast, it's unique in the fact that it does have this kind of rose-tinted, rose-gilded kind of place on this pedestal in the museum of failed consoles, because it was so unique and so and so inventive. I mean, and I suppose the final, from me anyway, the existential question is: would we all be here talking about this stuff if it had been a major success? I doubt it.
No, that's true. It's true. Would the Dreamcast Junkyard exist? Probably not, I'd imagine.
I mean, Tom, was part of you setting up the Dreamcast Junkyard because you felt that we needed to spread the love? Maybe if it was popular, would you have gone out of your way?
It was partly that, and also the very thing we're all talking about, how it was kind of set up to be this amazing console that had all the right ingredients, but then for whatever reason just failed to launch, and it was just bemused me. It's like how did this not become a massive success that it deserved to be? That's the thing. I think that's the key, and I think that's the reason why a lot of people are drawn towards a Dreamcast. So, in this hypothetical world where the Dreamcast was a success, it wouldn't have the same aura and the same kind of community around it as it does now, because it would just be seen as, it was just a successful console like the PS1 or the, whatever other console was a really, like the Wii, for example, that was a massive success, but that doesn't have this kind of weird, mystical kind of legendary, mythical status around it, does it? Because everybody had one. So.
Yeah, that's true. But you do get something. I mean, you were mentioning like, it would just be all the grey shooters and it would just be the generic stuff, and that's what Sega would have gone on to. But we did say about Nintendo. Nintendo have done, they've had a few knocks. Wii U was certainly a knock. That was a terribly selling console for them. But they came back with something like the Switch, which in its own way is a bit of a cult console, and it's sold incredibly well. So you don't necessarily need to fail to become a cult console. You can be incredibly successful and still have that essence of innovation and colourfulness and the stuff that Dreamcast is known for and that Sega was known for at the time. You can still have that and be a success because Nintendo are doing it. Fair enough, they have to concede to a degree, and they have ports of games from with the consoles, and they do have those kind of games on the system to an extent. But Nintendo seem to have got it locked in that they still have maintained what they're known for throughout the years. Do you not think that Sega would have continued with that? Do you think they would have just gone down the Sony Microsoft route and been a very generic console manufacturer?
I suppose for me, if I think about what I would have wanted for the system to be successful and have successes, is to have taken a more Nintendo approach than the kind of Sony Microsoft approach that we're in at the moment. Mm-hmm. Which is kind of Nintendo almost kind of walking to the beat of their own drum at this stage. So they've released a handheld console that's powerful to play handheld, but you can plug it into the TV and it comes with two controllers. I mean, it's a home run on so many levels. And I wish that so much of the Dreamcast library were on that console. So if anyone from Sega is listening, please bring Power Stone Collection to the Switch
Absolutely.
immediately.
Yes.
I would,
with online.
That's exactly. I mean, that comes back as well. I would have been playing. Imagine Power Stone 2 or 1, whichever your favorite is, whatever. Playing it online, or Power Stone online. Playing this on your Dreamcast online, and these kind of IPs. I mean, I know that that's Capcom and not Sega, but games that Capcom, Sega, all of this kind of era would have been making these new games and interesting IPs and sticking with this. And all I meant with my previous comment, which may have sounded a little bit negative on the kind of grey shooter thing, but I think that they would have come to the system. So this Dreamcast, we look at it and the library is full of these colourful games, and it's a little box of potential. Mm-hmm. And I think what it also would have needed and would have had on it, just like Nintendo has, The Witcher and other kind of more serious games are coming in on Nintendo, and it's not all about Kirby's and Mario's and Zelda's. Mm-hmm. That spread would have come to a Dreamcast successor. But Sega would have, kept on with their IPs in a much more kind of clear and concise way than they have done now, which is kind of, it's a bit of a mess, their IP situation from my view at the moment.
Sure. Yeah, that's very fair. That's very true. All right. I mean, I think we've gone through quite a lot of the what if scenario, really. I mean, there's always different permutations and different things that could have happened. And, listeners, if you've got an idea of what could have happened, your kind of what if scenario, we're obviously going to put a tweet out about this when the podcast comes out. Let us know in the comments, what's your what if situation? What would you like to see? What do you wish would have happened with the Dreamcast? Or do you think it was perfect the way it was? We're all, as we said, we're all kind of here for a reason, and that's because of what actually did happen with the Dreamcast. And we're on episode 74 of, a DreamPod podcast. Would this have existed? Probably not. Talking of tweets, I'm going to read through just a few before we come to an end, because I think there's some pretty good ones that came through from Twitter. I'll start with DreamPod contributor, DreamPod regular, Mike @space_turnip, who said in response to our tweet, it still would have lost to the PS2, but rather than get out early and cement its place as a legendary console in many gamers' minds, it would have met an ungracious end with subpar ports. Thanks, Mike.
It's a ray of sunshine.
Shout out to Mike.
Yeah. Moving on, Future PC @PCWZRD13, PC would have 13, says a few things would have happened for sure. The modem would have been replaced with broadband adapter as standard, controller revision with dual analog sticks released, and the third point on there is world domination. So basically, had we had broadband as standard and a dual analog stick controller as standard, it would have taken over the world. We've kind of basically said the same thing, I guess, haven't we? Apart from maybe the DVD as well.
And the world domination.
Yeah, it's true. A few others here. John Nicleary, J Nicleary, then Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo would have a lot of competition, and most games would be on Sega consoles. Yeah, I guess that's true. If Sega continued, we'd have seen more. Although, would EA have come back? Would they have come back? That's another question. And last one here. There's no name. It's just a couple of flags. Russian and Mexican, I think. But his @ is @Paco Cyborg. Said, I would say that most definitely Sega had to release a DVD reader just to keep up with the hype, and probably a new Sega console early 2005, way ahead of the PS3 and Xbox 360. I think that's true too. So yeah, there's a lot of people. I think there's some people on here have said as well that they probably wouldn't have minded it not have succeeding. Like we've said, there's a certain something about the way it actually went down that's the reason that we're here, isn't it? I think I'm not saying it very eloquently, but the reason that it didn't succeed, the reason that the fact that it didn't succeed, and that we're kind of left with this lineage of these amazing games, and then it just kind of disappeared. There's the what if scenario, the fact that we're sitting here saying what if this had happened, that's almost more interesting than if it actually had happened, I think. Do you think that's true? Kind of thinking about what could have been for Sega is more interesting than actually if it had actually taken place.
Yeah, it's always kind of more interesting to hypothesize about situations and what could have been. But this is our timeline. This is the one that we're on, and This is where Sega and the Dreamcast are. But I would kind of summing up my thoughts for the Dreamcast. I think that 2005 would have been way too late because that would have been a 7-year stretch. And back then, I know the pace for advancement is, I've seen released screenshots for the last kind of games that are now coming out for PS4, and or PS4 Pro, and they look ridiculously. They look better than real life, actually, but that's beside the point. At that time, it would have been very, very difficult to have had the console stretch for 7 years, no matter how good the games and the IP, because the PlayStation 2 just had the better processor. So flipping it on its head, I would have said kill the Dreamcast early, but they already did that with the Saturn. But let's say the Saturn was a success. Kill the Dreamcast early and release the Dreamcast 2 in 2003, 2002, something like that beats the PS2 on hardware.
Interesting. So kind of like almost like a mid-generation getting in there before the PS3, way before the PS3, getting in there very early. a bit like Nintendo, because Nintendo just kind of release stuff almost when they want, and it's Sony and Microsoft that are doing this punch for punch now. Right. And by Sega trying to match Sony, they actually jumped Sony here, so they were beating to the rhythm of their own drum, but there were only a few of us who were listening to the beat, or however you want to make your own metaphor from that. Much more eloquent than I've been so far. Yes. Any more thoughts about that?
I think Martin's hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah, totally.
To be honest, I think the real good future I would have liked for Sega may not even have the Dreamcast in it. I think that what I would have liked is if they'd have gone first party and not messed around for like the whole of the 7th generation, acting like they didn't care about any of their old IPs. And because now they're kind of coming back like, we're bringing Yakuza over, and we've got Space Channel 5, and we're doing a new Choo Choo Rocket, and they're doing all this stuff on Twitter and, promoting all these old IPs and bringing out merch for Jet Set Radio. And I don't know, I spent the whole of the 7th generation like clinging on to like that one interview where the guy says, we're going to bring Skies of Arcadia at some point to modern gen. That never happened. The only reason Shenmue HD got released was because Shenmue 3 Kickstarter was such a big success. So in my idea of the perfect future for Sega, it would have just been one where they'd have continued to release really cool games and port their best games to other systems. That's probably what I would have wanted from them, Dreamcast or no Dreamcast.
Tom, any final words from Tom?
No, just that I agree pretty much with everything that everybody else has said. So don't really have anything else to add.
It's fair enough. And like Martin said, this is the timeline we find ourselves in, odd as it is at the moment, being on lockdown. But that's the timeline. And we all, I think still, we have a WhatsApp group where we chat about Dreamcast pretty often. We still enjoy the games. These are 20-year-old games at this point, and the fact that they still resonate with us is amazing. So, the what if scenario is great, but actually, what actually happened is probably for the best. And look where we are now, and look at us all here sat together talking about it. So there you go. Best thing for it. And I wouldn't have written my book, which I'll mention for the third time in the podcast, if it hadn't been for what happened. I swear I will stop talking about the booksy. So. Thank you all for indulging me. It was kind of my idea to have a bit of a what-if scenario here, and we've not really done something like this before, so I thought it'd be interesting. So thanks for indulging me. I hope it was interesting to listen to. I hope it was interesting for you guys to talk about as well.
Certainly was.
It was really interesting.
Good. Some very good opinions and some very interesting discussions had. So before we head off, Lewis, whereabouts can we find you on the internet?
You can find me on Twitter at LewisJFC, name spelled Lewis, not the other way, just for the record. That's where you can find me. And you can also find me on the Dreamcast Junkyard Twitter, which I'm sure you're going to plug in a second. So, check out my tweets.
Lewis's tweets are epic. Just because I know you're playing Animal Crossing as well, what's the name of your island, in case anybody's interested in trying to find you?
It was my fiance's choice. It's Pawnee, which is the town from Parks and Recreation.
Very good. Very good. Martin, where can we find you online?
I have a Twitter that I don't really use too much, but that's Sega Collection, at Sega Collection. And I'm on Instagram at Mr_Quantum_.
Excellent. Tom, I'm asking you, but I know that we can't really find you many
Well,
places.
you can. I mean, I'd like to just plug my other podcast, which is the Power Drifting, the Rally Game podcast, which I do with my DreamPod co-host, Mike Phelan. You can find us on Twitter at PowerDriftPod or on the internet at powerdrifting.com.
Excellent. And a very, very good podcast it is too.
Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Very good podcast. You can find me at Oddment84. And of course, as Lewis said, we're also, the Dreamcast Junkyard is on Twitter at the DC Junkyard. So keep an eye out on that. We're actually, Mike is hosting at the moment an amazing tournament of Dreamcast games. What's it called again, Lewis? You made a lovely graphic for it.
Yeah, the World Cup.
Yes. So we're kind of voting.
The only
kind of series of
World
votes.
Cup.
Yes, the only one. The only one that matters. So you can vote for your favourite games as they come up in different categories. I think we're on round 2 at the moment, aren't we? Coming towards the end of round 2, going into round 3 soon. We're going to find out which Dreamcast game comes out on top, and I'm sure we'll have a bit of a podcast about that as well when we get down to the final rounds. Keep an eye on Twitter, of course. You can also find us by going to www.thedreamcastjunkyard.co.uk, where you can read all the wonderful articles that have been released since 2005. So there's plenty of them. And of course, Tom has written a lot of them. And if you've ever got a question about the Dreamcast, ask Tom, and he'll dig out one of his many articles to show you what he's written. So yes, that's everything from us today. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, join us for the next one. And thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Please stop this disc now.
Somebody better call Bill Gates and that Butler guy over at PlayStation, because Sega just brought a tank to the console war. For the past 15 years we've been developing our newest system, therefore it has 15 years worth of gigabytes, chips, circuits, sci-fi, CG, wires, LEDs, RAM, MP3s, Gmail, Net Zero, and graphics all jammed into one sleek plastic bod. Ladies and gentlemen, dreams do come true because I give you the Dreamcast 2.